There are moments when the sky seems to whisper, and then there are moments when it refuses to whisper any longer. Today belongs to the second kind. I want you to set aside every expectation you have for just a few minutes, because what is unfolding on June 26th is not the kind of astrological movement that announces itself with spectacle. Instead, it works beneath the surface, quietly reshaping the way you interpret your own life until avoiding the truth is no longer possible. I am not saying this to create unnecessary excitement. I am saying it because the symbolism of today points toward an emotional turning point that many people will only recognize after it has already changed them. By the time this day is over, some hidden pattern, some uncomfortable realization, or some long-ignored emotional truth may no longer be willing to remain invisible. That is why I believe this moment deserves your full attention. During this morning, the Sun traveling through Cancer forms an exact quincunx with Pluto in Aquarius. If the word quincunx sounds unfamiliar, do not worry, because understanding the technical name is far less important than understanding what it feels like from the inside. This particular alignment does not arrive like a thunderstorm. It does not force dramatic confrontations the way other planetary contacts often do. Instead, imagine carrying a weight that has been growing heavier for days without realizing it. At first, you barely notice the pressure. Then it becomes impossible to ignore. Eventually, you understand that the discomfort was never random. It was trying to guide your attention towards something hidden beneath the surface. That is the emotional language of this alignment. It creates a subtle but relentless psychological pressure that continues until you are finally willing to acknowledge what has been waiting underneath your conscious awareness all along. What makes this even more significant is that the quincunx is not acting alone. While this is taking place, another major influence is already shaping the emotional atmosphere. The Sun is also in a square with Neptune, and that transit reaches perfection on June 25th. That means we are already moving through an environment filled with uncertainty, emotional distortion, and blurred perception. It can feel as though your inner compass has stopped giving reliable directions. Situations that seem completely obvious may actually be misunderstood. Reactions that feel absolutely justified may be based on incomplete information. Even your strongest instincts can seem trustworthy, while quietly leading you away from what is actually true. This emotional haze has likely been building over the past several days, leaving many people with the strange sensation that something feels wrong, even though they cannot explain exactly why. Then this morning, everything shifts. Instead of the fog lingering indefinitely, the symbolic light begins to return. Yet what becomes visible is not necessarily comforting. It is Pluto waiting beneath the illusion. Pluto has never been associated with preserving comfort or protecting familiar stories. Pluto represents exposure, transformation, and the willingness to strip away whatever no longer reflects reality. It asks for honesty before it offers renewal. If you have sensed tension inside an important relationship, uncertainty within your professional life, or an unexplained emotional pressure that seems impossible to define, there is a reason those feelings have become stronger. This transit carries the potential to reveal 3 hidden truths that have been operating beneath the surface. Each one challenges a different layer of perception, and the final realization completely changes the way power itself can be understood. We will reach that insight later, but first it is important to understand why the timing of this sequence matters so deeply. Whether you realize it or not, you may already be standing inside the emotional fog created by Neptune. Looking back over the last several days, you may recognize moments when your confidence seemed strangely unstable. Perhaps your thoughts felt heavier than usual. Perhaps making simple decisions required far more effort than expected. Maybe your emotions changed without any obvious reason, leaving you questioning whether you could trust your own perspective. These experiences are consistent with the symbolism of the Sun square Neptune. Neptune governs dreams, imagination, ideals, and illusion. When expressed in challenging ways, It can also represent confusion, projection, and deception. At this moment, it is forming a square with the Sun from Aries, creating an atmosphere that disrupts emotional clarity and makes reliable judgment far more difficult. Only a few days ago, the Sun entered Cancer during the solstice, shifting attention toward emotional intelligence, instinctive knowing, inner security, and the quiet voice that often tells you something is wrong, long before logic catches up. Those inner feelings usually become valuable guides. They help you navigate relationships, recognize subtle emotional changes, and respond to situations that cannot be measured with facts alone. Yet under the influence of Neptune, even that trusted guidance system becomes vulnerable. The difficulty is not that your intuition disappears. The difficulty is that illusion can imitate intuition so convincingly that distinguishing between them becomes extraordinarily challenging. What feels absolutely certain may actually be the greatest misunderstanding. What appears emotionally obvious may be the furthest possible distance from objective truth. That uncertainty creates a deeply unsettling psychological experience because it encourages you to question the very inner wisdom you usually depend upon. You may have already seen this influence expressing itself in everyday life. Perhaps you suddenly felt responsible for saving someone who never asked to be saved. Perhaps you found yourself defending behavior that you would normally recognize as unhealthy. Maybe you experienced unexpected guilt after trying to establish a perfectly reasonable boundary, convincing yourself that protecting your own emotional well-being somehow made you selfish. If any of these experiences sound familiar, pause before assuming your feelings represent objective reality. Under Neptune, compassion can quietly become self-abandonment without announcing when the transition occurs. Empathy and sacrifice begin to resemble one another so closely that separating them becomes difficult. Many people have been making important emotional decisions while standing inside this symbolic fog, without recognizing how distorted the landscape has become. That is precisely why today's exact quincunx with Pluto carries such importance. Rather than allowing confusion to linger indefinitely, this alignment tears away the comforting veil and demands that hidden realities come into full view. The process may not feel gentle, but it serves a purpose. Sometimes clarity arrives only after illusion loses its grip completely. Before exploring the specific truths that Pluto intends to reveal, it helps to understand what makes a quincunx fundamentally different from other astrological aspects. Most people have heard of squares and oppositions because their symbolism is easier to recognize. A square creates direct pressure that demands immediate action. It announces conflict openly, leaving little room for denial. An opposition creates visible tension between two opposing forces, almost like watching two sides pull against each other in an unmistakable struggle. Both aspects can be difficult, yet they possess a certain honesty because the source of the conflict is usually obvious. A quincunx operates according to entirely different principles. It forms a 150-degree angle connecting signs that have virtually nothing in common. They do not share the same element. They do not express themselves through the same modality. They do not even approach reality from the same polarity. It is as though two individuals are trying to communicate while speaking completely different languages, each convinced they are expressing themselves clearly while neither truly understands the other. That unusual geometry creates the subtle psychological tension that makes this aspect so profound. And understanding that invisible disconnect becomes the key to recognizing everything this transit is preparing to reveal in the next stage. This is exactly why this alignment can feel so unsettling without ever becoming outwardly dramatic. It rarely announces itself through open conflict. Instead, it settles quietly into your awareness, like a question that refuses to disappear. You keep sensing that something is not sitting right, yet every time you try to identify the source, it slips just beyond your reach. It creates an emotional paradox where every possible choice feels incomplete, leaving you caught between moving forward and standing still. If the last several days have felt like an endless cycle of uncertainty, where no decision seems entirely right and every instinct comes with a second guess, you may already be experiencing the deeper influence of this planetary pattern. The reason becomes clearer when you look at the relationship between the two planets involved. On one side stands the Sun, representing your conscious identity, your awareness, and the version of yourself you believe you know. Across from it, connected through the exact quincunx, is Pluto in Aquarius, the planetary force associated with hidden motives, invisible influence, psychological transformation, and the dynamics of power that often operate beneath conscious awareness. Because of the unusual geometry of a quincunx, these two energies are not confronting each other directly. Instead, they create an unseen imbalance that quietly shapes your experience from the background. Rather than an obvious struggle, influence enters through places you never thought to examine. Instead of someone openly challenging your choices, subtle patterns begin directing your behavior without announcing themselves. This is why the transit carries such remarkable psychological depth. It does not simply tell you that something has been wrong. It gradually uncovers the invisible process that has been guiding your decisions, revealing either where another person's influence has quietly shaped your life, or where your own unconscious patterns have been steering you without your awareness. That realization opens the door to the first hidden truth. This alignment is inviting you to recognize. One of the most difficult discoveries under this transit is realizing that control is not always expressed through force. Sometimes it arrives wrapped in kindness, concern, and protection. That is precisely why this lesson can be so emotionally challenging. The Sun is currently moving through Cancer, a sign deeply connected with nurturing, emotional security, caregiving, and the instinct to shield loved ones from pain. At its healthiest expression, this energy is compassionate, devoted, and profoundly protective. There is genuine beauty in the desire to create safety for the people you care about. Yet Pluto asks us to look beyond appearances and examine the shadow that occasionally develops beneath even the purest intentions. The uncomfortable possibility raised by this quincunx is that protection can sometimes become limitation without anyone consciously intending it. There are moments when the person who believes they are keeping you safe may also be preventing your growth. They may sincerely believe they are acting in your best interest while unknowingly encouraging dependence instead of confidence. Think for a moment about someone who has consistently discouraged you from taking chances, someone who always had another reason why the opportunity seemed too risky, why trusting another person might end badly, or why pursuing a dream would probably end in disappointment. Their words may have sounded loving, their concern may have appeared completely sincere, yet over time you may have begun doubting your own ability to navigate life independently. Little by little, confidence gave way to hesitation, and self-reliance slowly became dependence. If this description feels unexpectedly familiar, allow yourself to consider what this transit is revealing. Pluto is asking you to distinguish authentic support from protection that quietly restricts personal freedom. That distinction may be one of the most important realizations available during this entire alignment. Every astrological symbol contains both light and shadow, and Cancer is no exception. The shadow expression of Cancer is not cruelty. It is overprotection taken to the point where emotional closeness becomes inseparable from emotional dependence. Sometimes, an individual becomes so invested in being indispensable that they unconsciously create circumstances where others continue needing them. The motivation may not come from malice at all. It may arise from fear, particularly the fear of being left behind or no longer feeling emotionally necessary. That possibility can be uncomfortable to acknowledge, yet Pluto rarely asks comfortable questions. Even more challenging is the realization that this transit is not focused exclusively on what others have done. It also turns the mirror toward your own behavior. Have there been moments when your emotional pain became a reason someone stayed instead of freely choosing to remain? Have there been times when guilt, vulnerability, or emotional intensity subtly influenced another person's decisions? Have you ever mistaken being indispensable for being genuinely cherished? These are not questions meant to produce shame. They exist because Pluto seeks honest self-awareness before lasting transformation can begin. The purpose is not to assign blame, but to recognize unconscious patterns that have quietly shaped relationships for longer than anyone realized. As difficult as these reflections may be, they create the foundation for genuine emotional freedom. The next realization brought forward by this transit reaches even deeper, and it emerged as one of the most striking themes while examining this astrological configuration. It is important to approach it with compassion because emotional pain is never being dismissed or minimized. Suffering is real, heartbreak is real, exhaustion is real. Yet beneath those authentic experiences, there can sometimes exist an unconscious strategy that deserves gentle examination. Remember the influence of the Sun square Neptune, the symbolic fog that has surrounded recent days. Neptune possesses an extraordinary ability to blur emotional boundaries while making sacrifice appear inherently meaningful. Under its influence, enduring hardship can begin to feel like proof of love. Giving endlessly can seem morally superior. Remaining in painful situations may start to resemble loyalty rather than self-abandonment. Neptune can quietly convince you that the more you endure, the greater the eventual reward will become. It encourages the belief that enough patience, enough sacrifice, or enough emotional suffering will eventually transform another person, or finally inspire them to become who you have always hoped they could be. That belief can feel deeply convincing while the fog remains in place, and it is precisely this illusion that the unfolding influence of Pluto now begins preparing to expose as the next hidden truth comes into view. For many people, there has been an almost invisible belief operating beneath the surface, one that quietly whispers that if they remain patient long enough, if they continue carrying the emotional burden without complaint, eventually everything will fall into place. The relationship will heal, the conflict will dissolve. The universe will somehow compensate every painful sacrifice with the outcome they have been waiting for. It is an appealing belief because it offers hope, and hope can be incredibly difficult to let go of. Yet the deeper symbolism unfolding through today's exact Sun and Pluto quincunx invites a much more uncomfortable examination. Think about your own experiences for a moment. Have you ever remained in an unhealthy situation long after your inner voice told you it was time to leave, simply because you convinced yourself that one more act of kindness, one more compromise, one more attempt to understand another person's behavior would finally create the breakthrough you had been hoping for? Perhaps you believed that loving more deeply would eventually soften someone else's heart. Perhaps you assumed that carrying more of their emotional weight would inspire them to change. Maybe you accepted repeated disappointment because you genuinely believed that endurance itself would transform the outcome. This transit suggests that the answer many people have been waiting for was never hidden in greater sacrifice. On some level, your deeper awareness may have recognized that truth long before your conscious mind was willing to admit it. Pluto, however, rarely allows uncomfortable realizations to remain buried forever. Instead, it shines a light on what has been quietly operating underneath the story you have been telling yourself. One of the most profound revelations offered by this alignment is that ongoing self-sacrifice can become its own unconscious form of control. That statement is not intended as criticism. It is an invitation to greater self-understanding. When someone consistently abandons their own needs, repeatedly choosing another person's well-being while neglecting their own, there is often an expectation existing beneath the surface that remains unspoken. It becomes an invisible emotional agreement created entirely within one person's heart. The message sounds something like this: I will continue giving. I will continue enduring. I will continue carrying this pain for both of us, and eventually you will recognize what I have done. Eventually, you will respond with loyalty, affection, appreciation, or personal transformation. The difficulty is that this agreement exists only inside the person making the sacrifice. The other individual may never have knowingly accepted those conditions. As a result, the cycle continues unchanged. The effort becomes greater. The emotional exhaustion deepens. The hoped-for transformation never fully arrives. Meanwhile, the person trying to rescue someone else slowly loses energy, confidence, and emotional stability, while wondering why nothing seems different, despite giving everything they have. Pluto exposes something even more challenging beneath this pattern. Sometimes endless sacrifice feels safer than making the difficult decision to establish a genuine boundary. Remaining in pain can appear compassionate. Continuing to tolerate unacceptable behavior may even seem virtuous. Yet saying, with complete clarity, that a situation is no longer acceptable, refusing to participate any longer, or choosing to walk away requires confronting uncertainty, disappointment, and fear directly. That step often feels far more frightening than simply continuing the familiar pattern of endurance. If these words are creating an emotional response within you, remember that recognizing this dynamic is not evidence that you have failed. Quite the opposite. Honest self-reflection requires extraordinary courage because it asks you to release comforting stories in favor of deeper truth. Many people spend years avoiding these questions altogether. The simple willingness to consider them marks the beginning of profound personal transformation, and that is precisely the type of awakening Pluto seeks to encourage during this transit. The third revelation carried by today's quincunx may reshape the entire way you think about influence, authority, and personal strength. At first, the idea can sound surprisingly provocative, but remain with it because its purpose is liberation rather than blame. Pluto asks an unsettling question that many people rarely consider. Why do similar relationship dynamics seem to appear repeatedly throughout your life? Why does one controlling personality seem to replace another? Why do emotionally manipulative partners, overbearing supervisors, demanding friendships, or environments that diminish your confidence continue emerging in different forms? Most people naturally explain these experiences through circumstances. They conclude they have simply encountered unfortunate situations, or that their kindness repeatedly attracts individuals who take advantage of it. Those explanations may contain elements of truth, yet Pluto encourages a much deeper exploration. Within Jungian psychology, an idea closely connected with Pluto's symbolic meaning is the concept of the shadow. The shadow represents the qualities we reject, suppress, or distance ourselves from because they seem uncomfortable, frightening, or unacceptable. One of the most commonly rejected qualities is personal power itself. Imagine growing up believing that strength inevitably leads to cruelty because every powerful person you witnessed misused authority. Imagine learning that speaking confidently resulted in punishment, criticism, or rejection. Perhaps you were taught directly or indirectly that keeping the peace mattered more than expressing your own needs. Over time, you may have concluded that remaining agreeable, accommodating, and emotionally quiet was the safest path available. Yet suppressing personal strength does not eliminate it. According to Pluto's symbolism, energy that is consistently denied internally often appears externally through other people. Suddenly, the force you refuse to embody seems to exist everywhere around you. The domineering partner, the controlling employer, the friend who continually demands emotional space. Each appears to carry the confidence, authority, or intensity that you have unconsciously separated from your own identity. This perspective is not suggesting that anyone deserves manipulation or abuse. That is not the lesson at all. Instead, It points toward the possibility that the qualities provoking the strongest emotional reactions may also represent aspects of yourself waiting to be consciously integrated in healthier ways. The authority that intimidates you in someone else may reflect leadership you have never allowed yourself to express. The confidence that seems overwhelming may point toward courage you have repeatedly hidden. The determination that appears controlling in another person may reveal a capacity for firm boundaries that you have been reluctant to claim. Pluto's invitation is not to imitate harmful behavior, but to recognize that genuine inner strength belongs to you as well. As long as that strength remains buried beneath fear or self-doubt, it becomes easier to hand influence over to those willing to exercise it. The moment you begin acknowledging that your own inner authority exists, even quietly, the balance of power starts to shift, and that realization becomes the foundation for everything this remarkable transit is preparing to reveal next. Everything about a quincunx points toward one unavoidable conclusion. It asks for change, but not the kind that comes from forcing circumstances around you. Instead, it insists that the adjustment begin within. As the Sun in Cancer forms this exact quincunx with Pluto in Aquarius, the invitation is remarkably clear. Stop placing your own strength into someone else's hands. Stop believing that another person must rescue you before your life can move forward. Stop waiting for external validation before allowing yourself to stand fully in your own authority. Pluto is not asking you to become controlling or intimidating. It is asking for something far more balanced. It asks you to embody your own power with maturity, self-awareness, and accountability. It asks you to reach a place where your confidence no longer depends on someone else's approval because your identity has become rooted in something much deeper. As I reflected on the symbolism of this transit, that realization shifted my entire understanding of what power truly means. It completely changed the way I think about difficult relationships and unhealthy dynamics. This perspective is never about excusing harmful actions. Anyone who has chosen to hurt, manipulate, or mistreat another person remains responsible for those choices. Pluto does not erase accountability. At the same time, this transit also reminds us that we carry responsibility for recognizing where we have continued surrendering our own inner authority. That distinction is where genuine transformation begins. It is not found in changing another person's behavior. It begins when you decide that your own relationship with your power will no longer be defined by fear. If everything we have explored feels emotionally intense, that response makes perfect sense. This alignment was never intended to provide comfort. The nature of a quincunx is to create a level of inner friction that cannot be resolved through familiar habits or familiar thinking. It quietly removes the effectiveness of old coping mechanisms until a different perspective becomes necessary. Over the coming days, rather than trying to force answers, consider observing yourself with honesty. Begin by paying attention to the moments when you immediately become defensive. The combination of the Sun and Pluto often awakens an instinct to protect your image, defend your identity, or carefully manage how others perceive you. Yet those protective responses may also reveal the very places where fear has been quietly directing your choices. Sometimes the emotional barriers built to prevent rejection eventually become the same barriers preventing growth. They keep disappointment outside, but they also keep authenticity locked inside. This transit gently challenges you to lower some of those walls, not indiscriminately, not for everyone, but enough that you can finally meet yourself without constantly hiding behind emotional armor. The next area worth exploring concerns the roles you may have been performing. Ask yourself where you have become more invested in maintaining an image than expressing your genuine experience. In what situations have you carefully presented the version of yourself you believed others wanted to see, instead of allowing your authentic thoughts and emotions to be visible? Pluto has little interest in appearances. Its symbolism consistently pulls attention beneath the surface until only what is genuine remains. As this influence unfolds, maintaining carefully constructed identities may begin to feel increasingly exhausting because pretending requires enormous emotional energy. Eventually, there comes a point when authenticity costs less than performance. This transit encourages exactly that realization. Finally, perhaps the most significant invitation of all is accepting responsibility for the emotional direction of your own life. This is not about accepting blame for painful experiences or taking responsibility for another person's decisions. It is about recognizing that while you cannot rewrite the past, you always retain influence over your next choice. As long as every explanation for your current situation depends entirely upon the controlling partner, the manipulative individual, the unfair system, or the difficult circumstances surrounding you, your personal authority remains tied to forces outside yourself. Pluto quietly reminds you that there is far more strength within you than you may currently recognize. Reclaiming that inner authority begins the moment you stop defining your future exclusively through what someone else has done. This message extends beyond individual relationships because Pluto's journey through Aquarius will continue for approximately the next 2 decades, carrying profound collective implications. On a broader level, this long transit reflects an ongoing transformation in the way influence and authority operate throughout society. Established systems built upon centralized control gradually face restructuring and replacement. Yet the emerging landscape is not automatically simpler or healthier. It merely functions according to different principles. Increasingly, influence becomes subtle, technological, interconnected, and difficult to identify. Rather than arriving through clearly recognizable authority figures alone, it often appears through invisible systems that quietly shape daily habits, decisions, and perceptions without drawing obvious attention to themselves. Many people already sense the emotional tension created by this transition. There is a growing desire to preserve private emotional space, while simultaneously feeling that privacy becoming more difficult to protect. That collective experience reflects the same symbolic conversation occurring between the Sun and Pluto through today's quincunx. The purpose of recognizing this pattern is not to create fear. Instead, it highlights why the personal work discussed throughout this transit carries importance beyond individual growth. Learning to recognize subtle manipulation within personal relationships strengthens your ability to recognize similar dynamics operating on a much larger scale. Learning to stand confidently in your own emotional authority prepares you to navigate a world where influence may become increasingly sophisticated and increasingly difficult to detect. The inner transformation and the collective transformation are unfolding together. At this very moment, the atmosphere created by Neptune still lingers. Emotional uncertainty may continue clouding judgment. You may notice yourself minimizing situations that deserve attention. You may still be confusing endless sacrifice with genuine compassion. You may continue reassuring yourself that everything is acceptable, even while a quieter, wiser part of you keeps insisting otherwise. Then this morning, the symbolism shifts. As the Sun reaches its exact quincunx with Pluto, the haze begins giving way to unmistakable clarity. The reflection revealed may not be immediately comfortable, but it may also become one of the most honest moments of self-recognition you have experienced in a very long time. The 3 themes we explored throughout this journey: protection becoming a vehicle for control, unspoken expectations hidden beneath self-sacrifice, and the tendency to project rejected personal power onto others, are not merely theoretical astrological ideas. They describe emotional patterns that quietly influence countless relationships and personal decisions every single day. This transit offers an opportunity to recognize those patterns with greater awareness than before. There is no expectation that every answer must arrive today. That has never been the purpose of a quincunx. Its purpose is adjustment rather than perfection. Lasting transformation often begins through surprisingly small moments of honesty, through one healthier boundary, one clearer decision, one willingness to stop participating in a cycle that no longer reflects who you are becoming. Those quiet shifts gradually reshape an entire life. The greatest breakthrough rarely announces itself dramatically. More often it arrives in the silent realization that you finally understand what has been happening, and from that moment forward, you choose differently. If even a small part of that realization has begun stirring within you today, then perhaps this transit is already accomplishing exactly what it came here to do. Before we finish, I simply want to say thank you for spending this time exploring these ideas with me. I know this has been an emotionally demanding conversation, and many of the themes we discussed can touch deeply personal experiences. If this exploration offered you a new perspective, and you would like to continue discovering more astrology and psychological symbolism together, I would truly appreciate your support by subscribing to the channel. I would also love to hear your thoughts in the comments. Have you begun recognizing any recurring emotional patterns in your own life? Is there something you now feel ready to release? Reading your reflections reminds me that none of us is navigating these transformations alone, and sharing those experiences creates a meaningful sense of community. Be especially gentle with yourself throughout the next several days as these energies continue unfolding, and I look forward to exploring the next celestial chapter with you very soon.